4 new bishops knelt beneath a white tent in the Swiss mountains. 15,000 people stood in the open air around them. From 70 countries, some of them men and women who had travelled days to be there. A pope 2 days earlier had written the word, please, but the moment that decided everything was none of those things. It was a single question, asked in Latin, older than the schism it was about to seal. Habetis mandatum apostolicum? Do you have the apostolic mandate? For 900 years, a bishop-elect answered that question honestly, because for 900 years, the answer was always yes. On the morning of July 1st, in a meadow beside a seminary in Écône, Switzerland, 4 men answered yes anyway. They did not have the mandate. Everyone present knew they did not have the mandate. And they said it regardless, because by then the ceremony was no longer a request being made of Rome. It was an answer already given, long before the question was asked. To understand how the Church arrived at that meadow, it helps to go back 3 weeks, to a much smaller room at Castel Gandolfo, where a group of journalists asked Pope Leo XIV a simple question. Was he going to let it happen? He did not raise his voice. He rarely does. He said the Vatican had invited the Society of St. Pius X to reconsider, that he was still weighing whether to make one more appeal. Let us try to live communion in the Church, he told them. But it is their choice. They must understand what it means for them and for the Church. Then he added something that sounded, to anyone listening closely, like a man already grieving a decision that had not yet been made. Division among Christians, he said, is always a painful matter. But the Society refused to accept certain fundamental elements of the Church, beginning with the Second Vatican Council itself. If they make those choices, I am sorry, but we must move forward. That sentence carried more weight than it first appeared to. Popes do not usually say I am sorry in the middle of a warning. It is not the language of authority defending its walls. It is the language of a father who already suspects how the conversation will end and is saying goodbye to a version of it that never happened. But to understand why this particular meadow and why this particular date, the story has to go back further than 3 weeks. It has to go back 56 years, to 1970, when a French archbishop named Marcel Lefebvre founded a seminary in this same Swiss valley in open opposition to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. Lefebvre had spent his life inside the pre-conciliar church, the Latin Mass, the old rubrics, a Catholicism that had not yet reckoned with the modern world in the way the Council asked it to. He rejected large parts of that reckoning outright, most of all a document called Dignitatis Humanae, the Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom. To the Council Fathers who wrote it, the document was an attempt to make peace with a pluralistic modern world, affirming that every person possesses a right to religious liberty that no state or institution may coerce. To Lefebvre and to the movement he built, it looked like something closer to surrender, the Church quietly conceding that all religions might stand on equal ground before the state, when for centuries it had taught that error itself carried no rights. That single disagreement, over a text most Catholics in the pews have never read, is still, 56 years later, the fault line running underneath everything that happened on Wednesday. By 1975, the Vatican had suspended Lefebvre and dissolved his society's canonical standing. He kept building anyway. And in 1988, in this same meadow at Écône, he did exactly what would happen again 38 years later. He consecrated 4 bishops without papal consent, in defiance of a Rome that had begged him, in writing, not to. The Vatican's response then was almost immediate. 2 days after Lefebvre's ceremony, on July 2nd, 1988, Pope John Paul II published a document called Ecclesia Dei, using a word that Vatican statements rarely reach for, rupture. He spoke of a genuine breach in the Church's communion, and he created a commission specifically to help Catholics who felt spiritually connected to the society find their way back without following Lefebvre into schism. That commission is still active today, and it is the reason a separate, smaller group of traditionalist priests, those who broke from Lefebvre in 1988 rather than follow him into excommunication, now celebrate the same old Latin Mass in full communion with Rome, inside parishes the Vatican itself sanctions. It is proof of a kind that the distance the Society insists cannot be closed has in fact been closed before, just not by everyone who might have crossed it. The Vatican excommunicated Lefebvre and his 4 newly consecrated bishops that same year. Under canon law, consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate carries automatic excommunication, not a punishment that Rome chooses to hand down after deliberation, but a penalty that activates the instant the act is completed, for both the men performing the consecration and the men receiving it. No decree is required to make it real. The Vatican may still choose to issue a formal statement, the way John Paul II did, but the excommunication itself does not wait for paperwork. What followed over the next 2 decades was one of the strangest, most delicate relationships in the modern Catholic Church, a body of priests and bishops formally outside communion with Rome, and yet never fully released from Rome's attention. The society continued to grow. Today it counts 2 bishops, more than 750 priests, over 260 seminarians training across 5 seminaries, more than 100 religious brothers, dozens of oblates, and roughly 250 religious sisters, representing 50 nationalities. It is not a fringe movement. It is, in the words of more than one Vatican analyst, a parallel church, pre-conciliar in its liturgy, its theology, and increasingly in its self-understanding. Rome tried more than once to close the distance. In 2007, the Pope at the time relaxed restrictions on celebrating the Old Latin Mass throughout the Universal Church, a gesture aimed directly at making the society's core liturgical grievance less urgent. 2 years later, in 2009, he went further still, lifting the excommunications on Lefebvre's 4 bishops entirely, an act of reconciliation that was meant to open a door. Instead, it became one of the most painful embarrassments of that pontificate. One of the 4 men whose excommunication was lifted, Bishop Richard Williamson, turned out to be a Holocaust denier, and in a Swiss television interview that aired just before the Vatican's decision was made public, he said openly that he did not believe Jews had been killed in gas chambers during the Second World War. The Pope later admitted that a simple internet search would have surfaced those views before the decision was made. The society itself eventually turned on Williamson, expelling him in 2012 after he ignored a deadline to formally submit to its authority and publicly called for its leadership to resign. That history matters, because it shapes exactly how fragile and how loaded this year's confrontation really was. Every gesture Rome makes toward the society carries the memory of 2009 inside it. Every refusal the society makes toward Rome carries the memory of 1988. Neither side is starting from zero. Both are negotiating across a wound that has never fully closed, in a relationship where trust runs out faster than either side would like to admit. Which is what made this year's attempt at dialogue, quiet as it was, feel genuinely different, at least for a while. In February, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the Vatican's prefect for the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, sat down directly with Father Davide Pagliarani, the society's superior general. He did not come with a warning. He came with an offer, a formal theological dialogue process, built, in his own words, with a very precise methodology designed to work through the specific doctrinal disputes that had kept the society outside full communion for almost 4 decades. It was a real proposal, not a formality. It carried one condition: suspend the ordinations planned for July 1st, not cancel them, not renounce the society's positions, simply pause long enough to talk. The society said no. Marc-André Mabillard, the group's media manager, made the position unmistakable in 5 words that left no room for a different reading later. We are changing absolutely nothing in our plans. It was a door closing quietly, in February, 5 months before anyone outside the society was paying close attention. By May, the door had closed all the way. Cardinal Fernandez issued a formal communiqué, this time without the language of invitation. Ordaining bishops without papal mandate, he stated, would constitute a schismatic act. It would trigger automatic excommunication for everyone involved. This was not new information. Canon law had said as much for decades. But the timing of the warning, 5 weeks before the planned ceremony, was Rome's way of making sure no one inside the society could later claim they had not been told plainly, and told by the highest doctrinal authority in the Church, exactly what the consequence would be. Still, the plans did not move. And that is what made the letter of June 29th so different from everything that had come before it. It was not a canon lawyer's warning anymore. It was the Pope himself, writing as pastor, on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, a date almost certainly chosen on purpose, the feast of the 2 apostles whose unity the early Church held up as the foundation of its own. With a paternal heart, he began, and aware of the responsibility entrusted to me by the Lord as the successor of the Apostle Peter, I address you, and through you, the bishops, priests, seminarians, and faithful connected to the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X. Further down, the words that would end up on headlines within hours. I feel it is my duty, through the authority received from Christ, to ask you to desist from your intended act. And beneath the formal Latin cadence of a papal document, a plainer, almost desperate line broke through. Please turn back, 2 words that a shepherd says to sheep already walking away from him. The Vatican released the letter publicly on June 30th, one day before the ceremony, which meant the society had less than 24 hours to change course, and the whole Catholic world had less than 24 hours to watch and see whether they would. Father Pagliarani wrote back almost immediately, though not with the word yes and not with the word no. He asked the Pope to take more time before deciding on any penalty, framing the society's intentions in the language of rescue rather than rebellion. Far be it from us to separate ourselves from the Roman Church, he wrote. We desire, on the contrary, to serve her by means that are extraordinary, as one would assist a mother in distress who requires particular help, even if such help is not understood by everyone. It was, in its way, a remarkable sentence. A man insisting he was saving the very institution he was about to be formally cut off from. By the time night fell on June 30th, there was no more ambiguity left to sit inside. The deadline was not a metaphor anymore. It was a sunrise 600 miles away, in a valley most of the world had never heard of until that week. And then something almost no framework could have predicted arrived alongside the deadline, a countdown clock. In the days before the ceremony, the Society's own website had displayed exactly that, a digital countdown ticking down toward the July 1st ordinations, sitting beside commemorative merchandise for sale to mark the occasion. A schism, marketed with the machinery of a product launch. For a movement that has spent decades presenting itself as the guardian of unbroken tradition against a modernised, marketed, consumer-facing church, the image sat uneasily. It was the first small sign that Wednesday would not simply be an act of theological conviction. It would also, unmistakably, be an event. The morning began under a bright sun. 9 o'clock, a white marquee erected beside the seminary at Écône, more than 1,000 priests, deacons, religious men and women filling the tent itself, and roughly 15,000 pilgrims from 70 countries standing in the open field around it. Whole families had arrived, some having driven through the night from Germany and France and Italy, children in their best clothes standing beside grandparents who remembered 1988, the first time it happened here. A live stream ran in 6 languages, with running commentary explaining each part of the ancient rite to viewers who had likely never seen an episcopal consecration in their lives. The ceremony would run more than 5 hours, start to finish. Early in the Mass, Father Pagliarani rose and spoke for more than half an hour in French, and what he said left little room to later claim the Society had acted out of confusion rather than conviction. From the Second Vatican Council to our own day, he told the crowd, the authorities of the Church have been imbued with a spirit contrary to the faith and have acted against holy tradition. He called the consecrations a sacred duty toward Holy Mother Church and souls, framing the act not as a rejection of Rome, but as an obligation owed to the doctrinal integrity of the Church as a whole. He returned, too, to the argument the Society has leaned on since 1988, an appeal to what canon lawyers call a state of necessity, the idea that in an emergency, ordinary rules of authority can be set aside to preserve something greater. It is the same argument Lefebvre made 38 years earlier. It is an argument the Holy See has repeatedly rejected, especially now after an explicit and personal warning from the Pope himself. And in a line that seemed aimed less at Rome than at his own listeners, Pagliarani insisted the moment carried no bitterness in it at all. We live these consecrations in joy and hope, he said. We do not live them in polemics, tension, bitterness, or resentment. He went further, addressing the accusation that would follow the Society for the rest of the day, that this was, at its core, an act of disrespect toward the Pope. We are accused of not respecting the Pope, he said, but it is precisely because we love him as the Vicar of Christ that we do not want to see him humiliated alongside false shepherds, representatives of false religions. It was a striking reversal, framing loyalty to the Pope as the very reason for disobeying him. Near the ceremony's close, addressing the 4 men about to be consecrated directly, he offered something closer to a warning than a blessing, that the greatest danger ahead of them would not come as open attack, but as a slow, gentle drift. Your worst enemies will not attack you head-on, he told them, but will try to make you slide gradually toward a more updated perception of the faith and of relations with the world. Then it was time. Bishop Alfonso de Galarreta stepped forward as the principal consecrator, with Bishop Bernard Fellet serving beside him as co-consecrator, 2 men who had themselves once stood at the centre of Rome's uneasy, decades-long attempt to bring the Society back into full communion. Men who had sat across tables from Vatican cardinals in years past, hoping for exactly the kind of reconciliation that was now, in this meadow, being formally abandoned. 4 candidates knelt before them. Pascal Schreiber, a 53-year-old Swiss priest, ordained at this same seminary back in 1998. a man who had spent almost his entire priestly life within these walls, being asked now to become one of its bishops. Michael Goldade, an American born in North Dakota and raised in Kansas, carrying the society's tradition across an ocean and back to the valley where it began. Michel Poinsinet de Sivry, 42, French. And Marc Hanapier, 36, also French, the youngest of the four, a man who was not yet alive when the first Écône consecrations happened in 1988, and who would now, in the very same meadow, help extend that unresolved rupture into a second generation. And this is where the question returned. Habetis mandatum apostolicum? Do you have the apostolic mandate? It is asked because the mandate is not a formality. It is, in the theology, both sides of this dispute actually still share. The very thing that makes a bishop of the universal church rather than the leader of a private faction. 4 men answered yes. Everyone in that tent knew there was no mandate. The Pope himself had spent 2 days publicly, painfully, making sure the whole Catholic world knew there was no mandate. And still, in the same breath, each candidate pledged an oath in Latin that included a vow to fight against schismatic heretics, a phrase that landed, for anyone actually listening closely, as something close to paradox. 4 men becoming bishops through an act their own church called schismatic, swearing under oath to defend the faith against schism. Under the automatic force of canon law, the excommunications took effect the instant the consecrations were completed. Bishops de Galarreta and Fellay for performing them, and Schreiber, Goldade, Poinsinet de Sivry, and Hanapier for receiving them. The penalty does not touch the validity of what took place. Canon lawyers are careful on this point, and it is worth being careful about it here too. The 4 men are now, in the Church's own understanding, validly ordained bishops. Their sacramental power is real. What they lack is legitimacy, the lawful right to exercise that power in communion with Rome. It is a distinction easy to lose in a fast-moving news cycle, but one the Vatican itself insists on holding on to, because it is the difference between saying these men are not bishops at all, and saying they are bishops standing, by their own choice, outside the body they were ordained to serve. No decree is required to make an automatic excommunication real, though Rome may still choose, as it did in 1988, to issue a formal public statement confirming it. The Vatican has not yet said whether it will. What it has said through Vatican News was quieter and in some ways more devastating than any formal declaration could have been. The seamless garment of Christ, which Pope Leo XIV had asked, in a heartfelt letter, not to tear apart, has now, in the Vatican's own words, been torn. There was one more detail from Wednesday that no framework could have written in advance, because no one plans for weather. About an hour before the 5-hour ceremony finally ended, an unexpected thunderstorm broke over Écône. Rain fell in sheets on the open field where thousands stood without cover, on the white tent sheltering the newly ordained, on the mountains that have watched this same seminary since 1970. Whatever anyone chooses to make of it, a coincidence, an atmosphere, nothing more than Swiss weather in July. There is something almost impossible to shake about the image itself. A schism sealed under a darkening sky. A downpour arriving exactly late enough to have let the ceremony finish, and exactly early enough to have soaked everyone who stayed to watch it happen. It is worth sitting with what this crisis actually is, underneath the ceremony and the Latin and the excommunications. It is not, at its core, a story about 4 men in a white tent. It is a story about how far a shepherd will go before he stops chasing, and how a small community, formed 56 years ago in opposition to a council most of its own current members were not yet alive to witness, chose loyalty to that opposition over the one thing every side in this argument claims to want most: unity with Rome. Pope Leo XIV spent his final letter using the word please. Not because the word carried legal weight, it carried none. He used it because it was the only word left that a father could offer a child already halfway out the door. The Church has survived this exact rupture before, on this exact patch of ground, 38 years ago. And the wound from that earlier schism has never fully closed even now. All these decades and one failed reconciliation later. What made Wednesday different was not the theology, which has barely shifted in 40 years of argument. What made it different was the plainness of the appeal that came before it. A pope who did not hide behind canon law or committee language, who simply asked, twice, in his own words and then in writing, "Be part of this with me." And a community that, faced with that plainness, answered a Latin question with a yes that both sides in that meadow knew was false. Somewhere in that gap, between a please that meant it and a yes that didn't, is the entire story of what division actually costs. That the storm came anyway, and the tent held anyway, and the crowd stayed anyway, says something true about faith on every side of this line. It does not dissolve simply because it disagrees. It endures stubbornly, sometimes in exactly the wrong direction, but it endures. What Rome does next, whether it follows the path John Paul II took in 1988, or charts something new for a very different church in a very different decade, may take weeks to unfold. What was lost on Wednesday will likely take far longer than that to measure. For continuing coverage of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate, including how the Vatican responds in the days ahead, subscribe to stay with the story as it develops. And in the comments, share which moment struck hardest: the letter, the question, or the storm.